Sukanya, should we begin?
Hi, Avantika. Yes, you can. Yeah, live.
Okay. Okay, great. So, hello everybody. Hope I'm audible. Sukanya, could you just give me a confirmation if I can be heard clearly?
I think you'll have to be slightly more louder.
Okay. So, hello everyone. Hi from the Center for Science and Environment, India. We are, some of us are still here in Brazil on our way back home after COP30 in Belem, Brazil. And we are happy to, quickly regroup after COP30 to convene this discussion to reflect on some of the big outcomes of the conference. I mean, we went into the conference this year with many questions about what is the big agenda, headline agenda item, what is the big expected outcome, and as it transpired in Belem, there was not one, but there were multiple big ticket agenda items that were discussed, as well as some new issues. So today I have my colleagues here from CSC and Down to Earth, our affiliate publication, to talk through. Okay, I have a comment saying, can I speak a bit louder? Okay, I am going to try to speak a bit louder. So today I have my colleagues from the Center for Science and Environment and Down to Earth, our affiliate publication. We have all been tracking the discussions, and we will be discussing what we have observed, as well as sharing some of our views and reflections on the way forward. So, with that, I'll get into what has been the overall context of the summit in Belem. So, the COP30 outcome has been called the Belem Political Package. This is what the Brazilian COP presidency gavelled in the final moments in the closing plenary. And there were a lot of as my colleague Shagun has put it, this COP was called many different COPs. It was called the COP of truth, the COP of implementation, the COP of adaptation. But our overall assessment has been that this was more than anything a COP of talk. Specifically, I mean, other than the fact that there was a lot of talk and little action, it produced a lot of dialogues and roadmaps that could eventually digress into just becoming talk shops for a lot of issues. So there was kind of that missing, concrete substance coming out of it. But a few key outcomes that are worth noting, which my colleagues will get into in the subsequent slides. There was the decision to develop a new just transition mechanism. There was some new language on tripling adaptation finance, and of course, Article 9 of the Paris Agreement was in focus. We did see some very interesting and also unfortunate dynamics around the issue of fossil fuels and the whole climate mitigation agenda. Particularly, fossil fuels and mitigation were not specifically on the COP agenda, other than the mitigation work program. However, in week 2, there was a proposal for a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels that was inserted, not in the formal agenda, but kind of tabled in the talks through the informal processes. And this really in week 2 became one of the biggest focus areas for media, for developed country priorities. So it was a little unfortunate the way this conversation was inserted forcefully in the talks. Of course, fossil fuel phase out is a very critical issue, and we have to discuss it in the context of developed countries taking the lead on fossil fuel phase out and helping to fund and enable the transition in other parts of the world. But this became kind of a bit of a disruptive issue in the second week. And ultimately, it did not make it into the final text coming out of COP30, but it is an issue that is likely to continue to, resurface in all of the talks. Of course, Just Transition saw a particular win. Adaptation, on the other hand, did not. What was interesting across the 2 weeks is this kind of elusive idea of the unity of the developing world. So the G77 and China bloc, which is the largest group of developing countries, 134 developing countries constituting 80% of the world's population. The G77 remained united on its issues and priorities throughout. And this was very heartening to see because there are always attempts to split G77 unity, which makes it easier to kind of, for developed countries to insert other agenda and kind of use them against G77 priorities. So we did not see this happening. And of course, there were some of the typical narratives about developing countries blocking ambition, meaning blocking fossil fuel phase out efforts and blocking more mitigation ambition. These are tactics that have been seen in the past, and we really need to inquire that if these kind of approaches are still coming up in the COP process, does the process really serve the interests of the global majority? And does it really remain fit for purpose? But when year after year we're seeing blame and burden being shifted onto the poor and developing countries of the world. So I think this has been our overall reading of the politics at COP30. But with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Shagun, who's going to walk us through what is this specific process convened by the presidency to address some of the big sticky issues at COP30. So Shagun, over to you.
Thank you, Avantika, and thank you everyone for joining us here. I'll take a few minutes to walk you through how COP30 started, what was the mood like, and what happened with the presidential consultations, because this, according to me, was one of the most important storylines, especially of the first week. As many of you know, COP often begin with this fight over the agenda. So this year also countries came to Belem wanting to add several issues to the negotiating agenda. But on November 10, day one of the summit, the Brazilian presidency pulled off something quite skillfully. They avoided an agenda fight altogether. And instead of letting negotiations getting stuck on day one, the presidency moved four of the most important contentious proposals, actually, which were also some of the most politically charged proposals, into a parallel process called presidency consultations. So, what were these four issues? They were a mix of priority from the global south and the global north. I'll just briefly outline what these four issues were, and the next speakers will be talking in detail about their significance. First is the implementation of Article 9.1, which relates to the obligations of developed countries on providing finance to developing countries. And second, the climate related trade, restrictive unilateral trade measures. These two were very important for the developing countries and the least developed countries. And the other two, which were about nationally determined, the NDCs and biennial transparency report synthesis, which provide an aggregate picture of where global efforts stand when it comes to the Paris temperature goals and highlighting gaps in ambition and implementation. These were important to global north and also for the small island states. Now, in the middle of the week, on Wednesday morning, journalists were told that there might be a good news about these issues by the end of that day, and the stock taking plenary was scheduled on the same day in the evening. But the plenary ended very abruptly in just like 5 to 8 minutes, and that was the time you could feel the tension, and that kind of showed the divide on these issues and how huge this divide was. India, on behalf of LMDCs, reminded the room of the presidency consultation several times that the decades of broken promises of Kyoto and Rio, and said that if developed countries want ambition, they themselves first must go net negative. So this mood was quite intense. Consultations were high stakes. Even though the presidency in briefings every day, they maintained that countries were quite united in understanding each other's points. One of the days in week one, the chair described the consultation as a group therapy session. Parties were told that they were loved. So it also came out to be something of a very, very clearly very difficult emotional diplomacy for Brazil as well. And by the end of week one, the presidency released a summary note that showed the complexity and deep divide on these core issues. The options that were presented in the summary note were very different from each other. They ranged from everything from an action plan to a dialogue to a work program, even a cover decision. So, this also meant that even as week one ended, countries were so far from each other when this week ended and the next week began. Then came the Motera text, which was first outrightly rejected by EU, the ILAC group. They also said that the package was quite detached from reality, and even the LMDC is an African group. So the stakes were incredibly high. And I'll stop here, and the next speakers will talk about what came out of all of this finally.
Thanks a lot, Shagun. I think it was certainly a very interesting diplomacy strategy, not only to prevent the agenda fight, but also to ensure that the sticky issues that were not finding a particular hook or a home were given adequate discussion space and time. And I do commend the Brazilian presidency for at least undertaking this effort, regardless of how things transpired in the second week, of course. So I think with that, we'll get into very brief updates on the individual negotiation tracks. So while the previous slide talked about kind of this broad approach to develop a cover decision, which incorporated both official negotiation tracks as well as sticky issues, which are not on the formal agenda. We'll now go through some of the formal agenda items which are on the negotiations. And I'll request my colleague Rudrat to give us an update first on the Just Transition work program. So, Rudrat, over to you.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'm Rudrat and I'll talk about the outcomes from the negotiations on just transition and also deep dive a bit on the country positions. So let me start with the core outcome. And as Avantika mentioned earlier, this year the G77 and China successfully pushed for the adoption of a new just transition mechanism. Now, the idea is to create a dedicated structure that can coordinate just transition efforts, enhance international cooperation, and build much needed capacity in developing countries. However, it's important to note that the decision only decides to develop the mechanism but does not establish it yet. So now parties will work towards delivering concrete recommendations by mid 2026 at the 64th subsidiary body meeting that is going to be held in Bonn, with a view to fully operationalizing the mechanism at COP31. Now, despite this progress, the outcome has several gaps. For instance, we don't have clear timelines or a defined set of technical functions or secured financing, which is far from the predictable additional support that the developing countries have been calling for. The other key issue in the negotiations was climate related trade restrictive unilateral measures that my colleague Trishant will also talk about. But in the context of just transition, it was pushed a lot by G77 and China. However, there is no reference to unilateral trade measures in the outcome. The need to articulate UTMs, as I said, was championed by India on behalf of like minded developing countries, which said that policies such as the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism reverses the flow of finance from the developed to the developing countries and violates the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities enshrined in the UNFCCC. Now, although the point on UTMs was articulated in the Mutirao decision, it has established a formal UNFCCC process for dialogues on this issue. In the outcome on just transition, there are also no explicit obligations placed on developing countries to provide financial support that would enable the implementation of just transition pathways in the global south. That said, the decision at least recognizes the need to scale up new and additional grant based and concessional finance, including non debt based instruments for developing countries. Now, beyond the mechanism itself, several important items have shaped the negotiations. First, on critical minerals, the EU and UK pushed for language encouraging supply chain diversification, But others like South Africa and Panama warned about the social and environmental risks that are tied to expanded mining for the transition. Uganda and Ethiopia preferred calling them transition minerals instead of critical minerals, but China opposed any references to the critical minerals debate at all. And because of these divergent views, the final text contains no language on this very significant issue. Now, second, on social protection, there were stronger references. The final outcome includes clear language on the rights of indigenous peoples, worker security, labor rights, education and skill development, social protection systems, and the needs of informal sector workers. So, just to recap, overall, the work program outcome provides an initial landing ground for the new mechanism, but the real test will be in the coming years. For instance, how the process advances, how detailed and ambitious the recommendations become, and whether countries can secure the resources to make this mechanism meaningful in practice. That will be all on just transitions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rudrat. And this was perhaps the only really concrete outcome of COP30, other than a lot of other processes which created dialogues, roadmaps, and so on. And it's very important to note here that civil society organizations, NGOs around the world, grassroots groups, trade unions have really led the push for this just transition mechanism to be achieved at COP30. So it's really commendable the way that this has been kind of a people-powered process, and I think that's very heartening to see in this current very cynical world. So with that, we'll move on to the adaptation outcomes, and I'll invite Tushant, my colleague who was also in Belem, to walk us through that. So Tushant, over to you.
Thank you, Avantika. So adaptation was a major agenda this year at COP30, and the centerpiece this year was the long-awaited global goal on adaptation indicators, which is basically a set of metrics that are designed to track progress on the global goal on adaptation. So for instance, things like water security, early warning systems, food security, etc. So coming into Belem, expectations were high as countries wanted to finalize a list of 100 indicators that had been developed over a 2-year work program. Uh, However, when countries came to negotiate at Belem, there were divisions on several issues. A central point of contention was the means of implementation, particularly finance. Developing countries noted that the indicator list does not actually reflect the resources that are needed to implement adaptation. Another concern was that some of the proposed indicators, such as those tracking things like national budgets, developing countries were actually concerned that this risks infringing upon the national policy space for many countries, and they were uncomfortable with this. So these were some of the disagreements on the indicators, and countries ultimately we're also split on whether to formally adopt the indicator list in Belem or not. Latin American countries were pushing for adoption, developed countries were pushing for adoption. African negotiators were saying they need a 2-year refinement process for the indicators. The LMDC, or the like-minded developing countries, of which India is a part, called for simply taking a note of the indicators rather than adopting them. But the final outcome adopted a list of 59 indicators, and it has also agreed to a 2-year work program to refine and kind of operationalize them. But many countries actually expressed dissatisfaction with this adoption, and this kind of disagreement also contributed to the chaos that happened in the closing plenary, which was talked about earlier. Along with the indicators, adaptation finance was also a highlight. The Mutirao text calls for tripling adaptation finance by 2035. For context, parties agreed in Glasgow in 2021 to double the adaptation finance to 40 billion by 2025 from the 2019 target, from the 2019 base year. But as the UN data has shown recently, that the adaptation finance has fell to about $26 billion in 2023. So this new target, setting a new target in 2035, is a bit ambitious, also because uh, it has not set a absolute numerical goal. It also does not specify whether finance should be primarily grant based, and it also does not identify who will be responsible for this tripling. So all of this means that the adaptation agenda remains unfinished. The GGA indicators, the global goal on adaptation, will continue to feature in the meetings in Bonn next year and also in the subsequent COPs. This is also a part of the text which says that the agenda will continue in the subsequent sessions. With that, I move on to the next topic. Next slide. Let me turn to Article 6 now, the part of the Paris Agreement that governs international markets. So Article 6 allows countries to cooperate voluntarily to meet their climate targets, and this cooperation happens through carbon markets. After last year's rulebook was finalized at Baku, COP30 was meant to take a stock of the administrative task, annual reports, and to some extent, it was also meant as an opportunity to test some of the elements that are already functional. So, under Article 6.2, which governs direct carbon trading between countries, the conversation centered on transparency, report quality. The first round of technical expert reviews that happened over the last year had revealed some inconsistencies and incomplete data that countries were submitting. But unfortunately, the COP decision just acknowledges these gaps and urges countries to correct them. But it does not put anything concrete or any punitive measures in place for this. On Article 6.4, the UN supervisory body, the UN supervised global carbon market, or it's now also known as the PACM, Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism. Countries took stock of the work that the supervisory body had done over the last year. Its first approved methodology on a landfill, and also its standards on baseline, additionality, leakage, and permanence. On the more contentious issue of the standard adoption of permanence, many submissions were received mostly from market players, warning that the standard could lead to the exclusion of land-based activities. Some countries wanted specific guidance to be given to the supervisory body, only detailed guidance to the supervisory body. On administrative matters, some countries pushed to relax the term limits of supervisory body members to retain their expertise, but others feared this could weaken the accountability. So this issue was deferred to 2028. Uh, on another issue of the transition of CDM projects to Article 6.4 mechanism, a decision 26, that is by 6 months. And just on Article 6.8, which covers non-market approaches, it focused on strengthening the existing Glasgow Committee on Non-Market Approaches platform, also how to improve the access of the platform to the stakeholders, and preparing a broader program review next in 2026. Can I move to the next slide? Uh, So there's an emerging issue of trade and climate within the UNFCCC space. Unilateral trade measures, particularly the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, was one of the four issues, as Shagun described, that countries wanted listed as a separate negotiation agenda item. While this wasn't accepted, the presidency took it up through consultation, and it was also discussed, as Rudrat also described, under the Just Transition Work Program. And throughout the 2 weeks, developing countries criticized the CBAM in both the platforms, saying such measures shift the burden of decarbonization onto poorer economies, contradict the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and undermine the spirit of multilateral cooperation. So some interventions evoked Article 3.5 of the UNFCCC, which states that climate measures, including unilateral ones, must not arbitrarily discriminate or cause a disguised restriction on international trade. And across both the negotiation tracks, CBAM was also described as an extraterritorial policy. Mostly, the most critical voices came from the Arab group as well as the LMDC. Developed countries, on their part, rejected this framing. The EU insisted that CBAM is a climate instrument to prevent carbon leakage, not a unilateral restriction, and argued that the UNFCCC has no mandate to assess national policies. Uh, Japan and UK also said that these issues should be dealt in WTO, not in the climate process. So the final COP30 outcome, which the 2 points that are uh, contained in the Mutiraw text, one of them reaffirms the Article 3.5 of the of the UNFCCC, the convention itself, and the other sets up a structured process, three annual dialogues between 2026 2028 under the subsidiary bodies in Bonn every year, which will involve the WTO, UNCTAD, and the International Trade Center, and which will culminate into a high-level event in 2028. So for many developing countries, although this does not offer a safeguard, but it has kind of opened us political space within the UNFCCC to discuss the trade and climate nexus. Can I move to the next slide? Next, the mitigation work program, another negotiation track. This again struggled this year to make much progress at COP30. Discussion focused on key areas, which were the two dialogues, the two annual dialogues that took place. One of them was centered on forest, the other on the waste sector. The other issue was the idea of a digital mitigation platform for exchanging knowledge, and the purpose actually was under negotiation. What should be the purpose of the digital platform? And the third issue was what happens to the work program after its mandate ends in 2026. So the outcome of the dialogue, the two dialogues on forest and waste, were discussed. But when countries tried to put these into formal key messages, this was rejected by many developing countries, who said that detailed messages from the annual dialogues into the work program become prescriptive, contradict the MWP's or the mitigation work program's facilitative mandate. It is not supposed to be prescriptive. Another debate was the proposal for the digital mitigation platform. And some of the countries argued that why is this platform even needed? It will just duplicate the existing UNFCCC tools. So eventually what was decided was the text basically says that it takes note of the existing non-market approaches, which is Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement. And it has a platform called Article 6.8 based platform. Actually the non-market approaches platform, and that will be used for the mitigation work programs advancement of the mitigation agenda. Overall, the mitigation work program, it remains stuck in that familiar disagreement that has happened over the years, and also raises doubts about its future impact, especially its mandate, the mandate of the work program. And when it expires in 2026, what happens next is still undecided. So I'll end there. Thank you, Avantika.
Thanks a lot, Tishan. And I think one important thing to note is that there is a difference between what are the formal agenda items that are listed on the negotiation agenda for the conference versus a lot of the issues that are kind of informally discussed in the outside space surrounding the core negotiation process. And I think on the mitigation front, what we saw is in week 2, there was a proposal to transition away from fossil fuels, to create a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels that was very strongly linked to the mitigation agenda. This was proposed and supported by multiple developed and developing country parties. And it was something that was, it became a point of contention in the final closing plenary as well, with many parties arguing that the outcome of COP30 is not adequately addressing the question of fossil fuel phase out and the transition that is needed. So I think this is one issue that came up in the kind of peripheral process, but in the core negotiations, the mitigation work program remains procedural and just hamstrung by a lot of tensions, as Tushant has mentioned. So with that, I will invite my colleague Seher Raheja to cover all the finance issues discussed across the board at COP30. Finance was once again not a specific major headline item, but it was featured in almost every track. So Seher, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think you summed it up when you said there might not have been a headline issue on finance this time, unlike last year at COP29 in Baku, but contentions across negotiation tracks centered around finance, and that's expected, I guess, at climate talks. So one reading that we as CSE made was that, a lot of the mistrust from the Baku decision on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, or the NCQG last year, loomed large across different tracks at COP30 this year. Including in adaptation, in the Moti Rao decision, on Article 2.1c, and various finance and non-finance tracks. So I'll just go through some of them, the key ones now, one by one. First of all, as Shagun was saying earlier, as part of the presidency-led overall political package, or the Moti Rao decision, a two-year work program on Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement has been created. Developing countries had been asking for a 3-year work program on 9.1 specifically, but what they've gotten instead is a 2-year work program on in the context of Article 9 on the whole. So this falls short of the demand because Article 9 also includes 9.1, which talks about provision of public finance by developed countries to developing countries, but also includes, for instance, 9.3, which talks about the mobilization of finance that needs to be done through a wide variety of actors and sources. So developing countries wanted the focus to remain on the public provision aspect of the NCQG, but giving a work program on Article 9 on the whole is a bit of a dilution from the asks. Yet we see it as at least half a step forward, because there will be a space to discuss the implementation or the operationalization of the NCQG decision at the very least. Secondly, the Baku to Belem roadmap to 1.3 trillion, which saw so much of noise and so many consultations and over 200 written submissions and just a lot of press through the year, really died a slow, fizzled out death at COP30. It has just ended up with merely, in one paragraph in the Moti Rao decision text saying that this presidency takes note of the Baku to Belem roadmap to 1.3 and welcomes the completion of the work by the erstwhile two presidencies on relating to this 1.3 trillion roadmap. So it was a report that was released ahead of COP30 itself, and in the final Moti Rao decision, it is merely taken note of. What this means, whether this is going to be just another report that was made after consultations throughout the year, or it actualizes implementation of the climate finance decision last year, remains to be seen. Then we saw accountability being an issue across different tracks on finance negotiations specifically. Let me give you two examples. Article 9.5 of the Paris Agreement was also being negotiated. This talks about the mandate for developed countries to provide biennial communications on their intended contributions on climate finance to developing countries. So in this negotiation room, a lot of key asks from developing countries, such as make your reporting NCQG linked. That is, specify how are you going to contribute towards the 300 billion goal that you agreed to last year. Include the split. How much money are you intending or hoping to provide for mitigation versus adaptation versus loss and damage? Provide some clarity in your 9.5 reporting requirements on how you're planning to share the burden of climate finance provision between the different Annex 2 developed countries. But none of these actually made it to the final text. It was all outright rejected by the EU, Japan, Canada, Australia, and other developed countries. And it basically has now, the mandate has remained unchanged, and no additional review and verification requirements, which would have increased accountability, have been included. A similar kind of schism was seen in the negotiations on the mandate of the UNFCCC's Standing Committee on Finance, or the SCF, which has been mandated with tracking the progress on last year's NCQG, but more specific checks and balances for how that accountability can be tracked by developing countries and civil society were rejected. On another negotiation, not really a negotiation item, but a finance track that was coming to an end, was Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. This is actually the third long-term goal. It talks about aligning all finance flows with the goals of the Paris Agreement and low GHG emissions. It was just to be decided whether there will be continuation of a dialogue on how to operationalize Article 2.1c. And the short answer is that another dialogue, or the Veritas dialogue, was launched to do this. So all we know for now is that discussions on 2.1c, what it actually means, what is the scope of making finance flows Paris aligned, are going to continue. And the safeguards that developing countries wanted included in it have been accepted, but a very stripped down or narrowed down version from the list that was initially there in the first week of COP versus the final outcome text. So while it does acknowledge that Article 2.1c or Paris alignment of finance should be non-prescriptive, non-punitive, and cannot be a substitute for the provision of climate finance by developed countries, it does not include several things such as a climate justice framing or linkages with just transition, or an explicit mention of systemic disenablers and barriers in the international financial architecture, preventing developing countries from making their finance Paris aligned at the same pace as the global north. Lastly, the Tropical Forest Forever facility was launched just before COP started in Belem, and they managed to secure a total of about 5.5 billion in pledges from different countries. They actually had intended to be able to collect 10 billion at least, so that they can eventually, by COP30, in order to eventually reach the goal of 25 billion, in order to mobilize 125 billion for forest conservation in rainforest nations. But none of this has happened, and a mere amount of 5.5 billion has been secured. Governments of UK and Germany notably have said that they don't intend on participating in the TFFFF. And just another note, different funds have been discussed and seen certain updates at COP30 as well. One of them being the Adaptation Fund, which received new contributions amounting to a total of 133 million. It's a drop in the ocean, but just an update worth sharing. I'll stop there on finance at COP30.
Thanks a lot, Seher. And we'll just have one final update before we conclude today's discussion. And I'll request Shagun to come in on some of the big outcomes and proceedings on agriculture and food systems. So, Shagun, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to talk a bit about what happened with agriculture and food systems at this COP, because the host country, Brazil, actually brought a lot of attention to forests and agriculture because of its vast Amazon rainforest. And it wanted to generate a kind of a momentum around these crucial climate issues. At least that was the understanding going into COP. We know that agriculture accounts for nearly 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, but this is also a sector that is one of the most vulnerable sectors. And we also know that how big industrial agriculture is a major driver of deforestation. So there was some hope that all of these issues might be addressed in one way or the other, but COP30's final outcome gave this sector surprisingly very minimal attention. In the official text, agriculture appears only once under adaptation, and with a very narrow reference to climate resilient food production. That's all. Experts have been pointing out how we need urgent transformations across global food systems, and unfortunately, this barely scratches the surface. One of the key negotiation tracks on agriculture and food systems is the Sharm el Sheikh Joint Work on Agriculture and Food Security. This was started in COP27 in Egypt. Workshops on it have been happening since then, especially in Bonn. So, whatever was discussed in those workshops, there was hope that some progress will be made in COP30, even though no outcome as such was expected this time, but there was expectation of some substantial discussions. But these discussions came to a halt within just 3 days of COP30 beginning, and it was decided that now these will continue in June next year in Bonn. Now, why this was important? So the discussion that had to be around the topic of systemic, holistic approaches to climate action in food and agriculture. But the draft text that came out after 3 days had a mix of approaches from like agroecology and indigenous knowledge, which are grounded in sustainability, to really contested ones like technology driven solutions such as precision agriculture, carbon offsets, and even artificial intelligence applications. These all, the latter approaches, these were added at the last minute to the draft text. And in many cases, we have seen that these approaches are problems rather than solutions, and they're heavily influenced by corporate interests. So there's already a growing debate around the world between these different visions of how the future of agriculture will be like. So it was very crucial for this COP that these approaches are discussed at least. Another concern was a lot of corporate influence, like the fossil fuel lobby. We have been seeing that there's a growing presence of industrial agriculture lobby as well at COPs. Outside the formal negotiations, there was a whole dedicated area called the agri zone, where major agribusiness and even dairy and meat corporations, they promoted what they called solutions. And these sectors are some of the, among those driving deforestation in the Amazon through the expansion of soy, maize, and even cattle production for export. Um, Apart from this, another sticking point was finance, or rather the lack of it. Key issues like expanding access to climate and adaptation finance for agriculture, and ensuring that countries meaningfully integrate agriculture into their NDCs and national adaptation plans. They remained bracketed in the draft text, which meant that there was no consensus. So now the major crunch will happen in Bonn in June 2026, and then finally in COP31. It's also crucial because next year, COP31, this is the last final year for the Sharm el Sheikh joint work, and this makes the upcoming negotiations absolutely critical for setting a meaningful and effective agenda on agriculture in the whole global climate process. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Shagun, and everyone else. So I think so with that, we kind of wrap up the individual track-wise briefs and updates. And I think across the board, what we noticed, this particular COP going into the climate summit, there was a lot of uncertainty around what the major discussions will be. But it became evident that going in, developing countries had a few very specific goals. There were specific goals around the Just Transition Work Program. There were specific goals around adaptation finance. The issues of Article 9.1 on finance, as well as the issue of unilateral trade measures, were raised by developing country blocs. So there were clear agenda issues that developing countries had in mind. But of course, that's not necessarily how the talks played out. We saw that a lot of the conversation around finance was actually, there were attempts to derail that by bringing in the question of more mitigation ambition. Developed countries talked about how NDCs haven't been submitted by large developing countries. So there was a lot of deflection of a lot of the critical issues that the G77 and China had been working on for months leading up to COP30. And these were very clear attempts by developed countries to deflect from their obligations on finance, the increasing demands to discuss unilateral trade measures, the requests for tripling of adaptation finance flows. So there was a clear diversionary tactic at play. So I think there was perhaps some hope that given the state of the world outside, where we have very turbulent geopolitics, we have absolutely retreating international climate finance flows, we have military conflicts. There was hope that the COP process might still retain some, sense of hope in global cooperation on climate efforts. Our reading is that the COP process did not instill that confidence. Instead, it kind of rehashed a lot of the old tactics and patterns of deflecting blame onto developing countries, shifting the burden onto them. Of course, the US was not in these talks. although there were some sightings of US, former negotiators and delegation members. But the US is obviously has exited the Paris Agreement, and that leaves a massive gap in this whole idea of NDC ambition. How do you even talk about ambition on NDCs and mitigation with the world's largest historical polluter exiting the process and not even being committed to future efforts to reduce emissions anymore? So I think this was very evident. But unfortunately, other developed countries like the EU and its allies, instead of reckoning with this reality, decided to shift the blame of lack of ambition onto large developing countries. So Saudi Arabia, China, India, members of the LMDC bloc, they became the new bogeyman for the European Union and allies. And that was very unfortunate to see. Um, it's also completely divorced from the reality that we're seeing in the world today. It's a false narrative that developing countries are blocking ambition. Developing countries objected to a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels that was inserted in week 2 as a non-negotiated agenda item. There were no clarity or details around the boundaries, conditions, criteria for this roadmap, and that is what they were blocking. But the narrative became that they are blocking ambition on mitigation. But the reality is today, a lot of large developing countries are leading on climate. So, you have China that's got the world's largest clean technology program in place. India has achieved one of its 3 NDC targets 5 years ahead of schedule. Today, 51% of global solar power is produced by BRICS countries. So this whole question of developing countries being blockers of ambition it's tired, it's false, and it's something that we have to really start inquiring why it keeps coming up again within this process. It creates a highly polarized and divisive atmosphere that is not helpful for consensus building or cooperation. But what we did observe is that the collective influence of the developed countries, the global north, who have a very small percentage of world population, but outsized power and wealth, their influence is very large in these negotiations, and as well as the influence of the media that they feed. So I think it played a pretty detrimental role from that perspective. So that's the end of our brief and update on COP30. Of course, these processes move slowly, as we have seen over the past 30 years. There is a recognition that the COP and Paris process has led to lower emission trajectories than would have occurred in the absence of this process. But today we have to really inquire if the ongoing needs of the global majority are still being met by this process or not, and whether it really does remain fit for purpose. I think that's been one of our key reflections that we'll think about more in the months to come. So I will stop sharing the presentation here, and we'll just go to a few questions. So I did see in the chat box, and yes, to all the questions about will we share the presentation, we will definitely be doing that. So I think one of the first comments that I'll pick up from the chat box is a question around critical minerals and the role that it played in the just transition negotiations. So maybe Rudrat, would you like to come in on that and talk about some of the dynamics that played out?
Yeah. So interestingly, when the COP began, there was no reference to critical minerals in the Just Transition Work Program. However, it got elevated after EU pushed for fair distribution of benefits and diversification of supply chains, reflecting, and I think that reflects a very that reflects a real world political economy issue where countries, especially developed countries, are vying for a greater control over supply chains that they do not possess, especially towards the downstream activities such as processing and refining. Africa, that does have a lot of minerals, does not really have control over the supply chains in a different context. So, for example, Uganda and Ethiopia, they did not want critical minerals to be added. Rather, they wanted to address it as transition minerals, probably because the word critical is understood in different contexts. It's not limited to clean energy technologies. It's also about artificial intelligence, defense, and other consumer electronics, and other aspects of and many other aspects of transition that countries are opting for. China, and I was looking at the question some person raised, linking it to G20. I think there was a very specific comment, very specific framework for critical minerals in G20, which countries address. However, the Just Transition Work Program, this was the first time critical minerals entered the debate. And China and many other countries were not sure what would be the relevance of critical minerals in the work program, in the negotiations, and how will it be framed. So I think that was a sort of a non-negotiable, just because of the lack of clarity around the issue. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rudrat. So there's a question about how was India's stand on multiple discussions. So India came into this particular COP making a few issues its headline priorities. So the issue of Article 9.1, India wanted it to be a formal agenda item. That is not what eventually happened. It produced a 2-year work program instead on Article 9, as Seher had mentioned earlier. Adaptation was a priority for India, adaptation finance in particular, as well as indicators linked to means of implementation. India also supported the call to highlight the issue of unilateral trade measures consistently, really spotlighting that these trade measures can shift the burden of the cost of decarbonization onto developing countries. Interestingly, within a few days of the conference beginning, India announced that it would also support a just transition mechanism um, in a statement by the minister, and I think that was extremely useful and valuable to kind of tip the scales in favor of ensuring that this mechanism is secured. Given India's positioning within the G77. There was also an announcement by the environment minister that India's next NDC, which there has been a lot of pressure on India to produce one. He announced that the NDC is imminent and it will be released in the near future. A specific date or timeline was not specified. But the NDC, along with the first biennial transparency report, would be produced. So I think these were some of the big kind of issues that India had pushed for. Also, I think in the final plenary and in the second week proceedings, India was certainly one of the countries objecting to the idea that a non-negotiated item like the fossil fuel, transitioning away from fossil fuels roadmap should be a part of the final text. And I think it had been fairly vocal about that. I think any process like this needs to be discussed and negotiated in the multilateral process with the criteria clearly agreed upon by all parties. So it was a fairly rational issue that India had also kind of argued against. So yeah, so that's kind of India's perspective. There were a couple of questions on Article 6, if Tushant, you'd like to take them.
Yeah, I think, yes, I see a question in the chat. Um, 1 second. So the question is around whether discussions took place on, sorry, yeah,
So there's a question from
how parties
Charvi.
perceive the,
Yeah, there's a question from Charvi about, can you elaborate more on Article 6? When can we expect PACM to kick off? And is there a place for avoidance credits? I think there's quite a lot to unpack over there. So maybe if you want to address that.
right. So there's no date has been specified for when the PACM would begin. It is hoped that next year it should start. Regarding avoidance credits, it's still on the table. The avoidance credits have not been taken off the Article 6, so they are still a part of the Article 6 mechanism. On the question of parties perceived the plans for SME support on Article 6, I think asked by Rakesh. Uh, There was no specific discussion on SMEs capacity building, but the closest discussions that happened were the general concerns about capacity building, especially for developing countries. And the final texts, both the 6.2 and 6.4, recognize the need for capacity building in countries. And in this particular area, the ambition dialogues are being utilized to highlight some of the issues that countries have. But I have not seen countries bring up the specific issue of capacities regarding GHGs or carbon accounting and such other issues. Although UNDP did make an intervention stressing that many countries lack the institutional capacities for NDC accounting and GHG calculation. Yes, UNDP brought that up in the ambition dialogue, not in the negotiations. But specifically around SMEs, that discussion hasn't happened so far.
So, Sahil, would you like to comment on the question around definition of climate finance? And there's also a question on the TFFF proposal, which we have been looking into a little bit. So maybe if you'd like to add on a little bit about that, and yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I think first of all, the climate finance definition question, actually, this became a huge issue last year in the lead up to the talks in Baku on the new climate finance target, the NCQG. India, on behalf of the LMDCs, was championing it and, really pushing for the need for clarity beyond the operational definition of climate finance. But to my knowledge, across the finance tracks, that did not come up this year strongly or for resolution. So I don't think, as it stands between COP29 and COP30, magically some kind of climate finance new definition has been agreed upon. That's the short answer. That's not been resolved in that sense. I know it sounds ironic because we're talking about how finance was a tricky and, climate finance was a core issue across tracks. But as far as the legal definition is concerned, I don't think there's been progress in the way that the question has been framed, like under UNFCCC legal definition. That's on the first part. On TFFF, what is our opinion on the proposal? That's the question, right? On the tropical forest forever facility. Is that the one?
Yeah. Yeah.
I can actually, I can just say very briefly and hand back to you maybe to elaborate on that. TFFF, we do think that it came out with a lot of glitz and glamour ahead of COP, like a lot of different items under the Brazilian presidency. And while in principle it sounds important and is necessary to increase finance for rainforest conservation, we found a couple of things that could be problematic with the implementation going forward. First of all, the financial mechanism itself, it hinges on what is a risk premium and not actually earnings or any kind of fair share or more effort by developed economies. What it relies on is more or higher returns from debt in EMDEs or emerging markets and developing economies. So that the kind of mechanism itself hinging on what is actually a flaw of the international financial architecture doesn't sit well with us in principle or in practice. And secondly, as I said at the start, at the launch of the TFFF as well, they initially know that they want 25 billion to mobilize 125. Then they said, okay, let's try and collect 10 billion. But the actual pledges that were achieved pre-COP were only around 5.5. So that's where the progress stands. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And we've done, my colleague Rudrat has done a detailed analysis on TFFF in an article for Down to Earth, which one of us will share in the chat box. So thanks for that, Sehed. Tracy, I completely agree that we should use the NCQG work program to try to advance the issue of what counts. Definitely. I think this work program, there's been some reflection on should it have been focused on Article 9.1? It should have, but even the fact that we have a broader work program on Article 9 at this point, I think it's a win we should take because we do have the space and flexibility to shape what gets discussed within this work program. And if it even comes to discussing Article 9.3, which is mobilization, we could always use it as a space to highlight the issues of low mobilization ratios, the risks and issues with blended finance. So yeah, I think it can be a space that can be used constructively if we put a concerted effort to do that. Um, I also see some questions from Chandrima. I think on what to watch in the agenda that might be prioritized on the road to COP31, and the role that we can see India playing in the next few years. So India has put in a bid to host, I want to say COP33. Correct me if I'm wrong. And next year we have actually, so this was one of the big updates coming out of Belem, a kind of a joint presidency of Australia and Turkey, which apparently is something that has been done in the past. But then how that plays out in terms of one a presidency kind of leading the negotiations, another leading maybe the action agenda, the consultations. It seems a bit tedious at this point, but if that's the kind of arrangement we are getting, we'll have to figure out how to work with those two presidencies diplomatically to advance some of these agenda items. It's very interesting to me personally, some of the things, although we have said that a lot of talk shops and dialogues have come out of this COP. I think there's been a sort of some very interesting signals also coming out for further work. So one of the things that was outside of the negotiation process that was announced was the Belem Declaration on Principles for Green Industrialization. Um, and that is, for example, an issue that not only CSE, but a lot of other critical researchers from the Global South and beyond are really championing. There's a lot of work across the African continent on the issue of green industrialization. So that is a really great signal coming out of the COP process to show that these issues need to be prioritized and amplified within the COP process in the coming years. Of course, the upcoming dialogues on trade, climate-related trade measures will be an important space to highlight. I think in a year when we have seen outside of UNFCCC, the biggest headline issue is trade. Whether it is the issue of tariffs, whether it is the question of CBAM and EUDR, whether it is the question of FTAs being signed by different countries. I think trade has been kind of the biggest headline. So I think if it's coming up in the dialogues in the coming years, it will be a very important space to watch. And also very concrete issues like critical minerals and transition minerals coming into the just transition debate. These are very real world issues that we now have a hook in the COP process, which I think creates a sort of space to really examine these and make some of that so-called implementation happen. Given that the space so far has been quite procedural and it's been quite bureaucratic, and so on. So those are some of the things that we are certainly going to be reflecting on the road to the joint Turkish and Australian presidency. So I think that's about it. Any other questions? Would any of my other colleagues like to highlight? Seher, Dishant, would you like to comment on anything? Because we still have a bit of time, but we can even wrap up early, no worries, but just want to check.
No, I don't think so. Anything from my side.
Okay, Shagun, anything you want to comment on?
No, I think yeah, most of it yeah, we have covered, and you mentioned about so many the green industry pledge as well, and along with that, so many other pledges happened in the action agenda, which will also be interesting, to see how things move forward on them next year. That's all.
Great, sounds good. We are going to wrap up here. Thank you so much to everybody who has joined. And we will be, of course, uploading these slides. We have our press release that is uploaded on the website, and there will also be a long form detailed analysis published on Down to Earth within this week. which we will be uploading online. So thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to engaging with all of you. And yeah, happy to answer more of your questions by email as well. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.